Few paintings in history have unsettled the human soul like this one. In a dark, windowless room, an ancient god, wild-eyed, blood-stained, and monstrous, devours the limp body of his own child. The scene is brutal, disturbing, and unforgettable. This is Saturn Devouring His Son by Francisco Goya, one of the most terrifying images ever created. Painted directly on the walls of his home in the final years of his life, it was never meant for public eyes, and yet it has become one of the most discussed, debated, and feared works of art in the world. It is not just a painting, it is a cry from a man, from an era, from the deepest corners of the human psyche. To understand the horror of this image, we must understand the man who created it. Francisco Goya was not always a painter of nightmares. Born in 1746 in Spain, he rose to fame as a court painter, celebrated for his portraits of royalty, his grand historical scenes, and his light, joyful tapestries. But as he grew older, Goya's world collapsed. He lost his hearing after a severe illness. He witnessed his homeland torn apart by war, the brutal Napoleonic invasion, and the bloody Spanish resistance. He watched the Inquisition return with torture and executions, and he saw the very ideals of the Enlightenment, reason, progress, liberty, drown in blood. The Goya who painted Saturn was not the same man who once painted kings. He was a man broken by history. Between 1819 and 1823, Goya created what are now known as the Black Paintings, a series of 14 nightmarish works painted directly onto the walls of his house, Quinta del Sordo, the House of the Deaf Man. They were never signed, never titled, and never meant to be sold. They were deeply personal, raw expressions of despair, anger, fear, and madness. In them, Goya abandoned the conventions of art. He used dark, almost violent brushstrokes, grotesque figures, and chaotic compositions. These were not paintings for an audience. They were paintings for himself, a dialogue with his demons. The subject of the painting comes from Roman mythology. Saturn, or Cronus in the Greek version, was the king of the Titans. Warned that one of his children would overthrow him, he devoured them as soon as they were born. But destiny could not be stopped. His son Jupiter, Zeus, survived and fulfilled the prophecy. Goya's depiction is unlike any before it. Earlier versions showed Saturn calmly swallowing his child, often with classical dignity. Goya's Saturn is wild, his eyes bulging with madness, his mouth dripping with blood. This is not a mythological figure. This is hunger, paranoia, and terror incarnate. Is this painting simply a depiction of a myth, or is it something deeper? Some scholars see Saturn as a symbol of time itself, devouring everything it creates. Others believe he represents political tyranny, consuming the very people it is meant to protect. And some go further still, seeing in Saturn a self-portrait of Goya, an old man devouring his own legacy, consumed by regret, rage, and the fear of irrelevance. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. This is not a painting about mythology. It is a painting about humanity. One of the most compelling interpretations of Saturn devouring his son is that it's not about mythology at all. It's about politics. Spain in the early 19th century was a nation consumed by chaos. The Napoleonic invasion had left the country in ruins, and the restoration of King Ferdinand VII brought back the horrors of absolutism and the Inquisition. In this reading, Saturn represents the state, a power so paranoid and hungry for control that it devours its own people. It's a metaphor for governments that destroy the very citizens they claim to protect. Goya, who had witnessed executions, torture, and repression firsthand, might have painted Saturn as a condemnation of tyranny. Another powerful reading sees Saturn not as a tyrant, but as time itself. In mythology, Cronus was associated not just with kingship, but with the relentless march of time. Time creates life, and then destroys it. It builds empires, and then crumbles them to dust. The devouring of the child becomes a universal truth. Time consumes everything it gives birth to. In this interpretation, the horror is existential. It is not about politics or myth. It is about mortality itself. Goya, nearing 80 and facing his own death, may have been confronting the unstoppable force that swallows all creation. But perhaps the most disturbing theory of all is the one that sees Saturn not as a god or a metaphor, but as Goya himself. By the time he painted the black paintings, Goya was isolated, bitter, and disillusioned. He had outlived many of his friends and family. His reputation had faded. He was haunted by memories of violence and injustice. In this reading, Saturn's madness, his desperate, wild-eyed hunger, is Goya's own reflection. He is the old man devouring his legacy, the artist consumed by regret, rage, and the fear of irrelevance. The painting becomes a self-portrait of the human condition, a confession painted in blood and shadow. Art historians continue to debate the details. Why is the child's body half consumed? Why are Saturn's hands trembling? Why is the background empty and black, devoid of context? Each element adds to the painting's complexity. The black void may symbolize the abyss of time, the trembling hands, the horror of guilt, the half-eaten body, the incompleteness of destruction. A reminder that what we consume never truly disappears. Even the blood around Saturn's mouth might symbolize original sin, the stain humanity cannot escape. Regardless of interpretation, one thing is clear: Saturn devouring his son is not just about mythology or Goya's personal demons. It is about the human condition itself. It is about fear, fear of time, fear of power, fear of death, fear of ourselves. Goya painted a mirror. In Saturn's horror, we see our own. In his madness, we glimpse our own capacity for destruction. And in his desperate hunger, we see the insatiable forces, political, natural, and psychological, that define human history. More than 70 years before Sigmund Freud published his theories about the unconscious, Francisco Goya had already painted it. Saturn devouring his son can be read as a visualization of what Freud would later call the id, the raw, primal part of the human psyche that operates on instinct, hunger, and fear. Saturn is the embodiment of the devouring father, a symbol of patriarchal authority and primal fear. He represents the darker forces that shape our behavior, the urge to dominate, to destroy, to consume, impulses we often try to bury beneath civilization. Decades after Goya's death, Friedrich Nietzsche would write about the will to power, the relentless consuming drive that underlies human action. In Saturn's monstrous appetite, we see that same force at work. Nietzsche also spoke of the abyss, the darkness within us that we fear to look into. Goya doesn't just look into that abyss, he paints it. The devouring father is not just a myth, he is the embodiment of our own destructive potential, the darkness that lives inside every human soul. The image of Saturn devouring his child became a recurring motif in literature after Goya. Poets and writers of the Romantic era saw in it a metaphor for human suffering, tyranny, and fate. Francisco de Quevedo, Charles Baudelaire, and later Franz Kafka echoed its themes in their explorations of existential dread and oppressive authority. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, the image reappears in dystopian novels, in psychoanalytic essays, in political critiques. Saturn has become a symbol of systems, political, social, familial, that consume the very people they were created to serve. Filmmakers, too, have drawn deeply from Goya's terrifying imagery, from Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey to Darren Aronofsky's Mother. The theme of creation devouring its creation runs like a dark thread through cinema. Even horror films, from The Omen to Hereditary, echo the primal fear captured in Goya's masterpiece. The devouring father has become a cinematic archetype, the unstoppable force that destroys what it loves. The creator who cannot stop consuming what he has made. Modern artists, from Francis Bacon to Anselm Kiefer, have cited Saturn devouring his son as a direct influence. Bacon's screaming popes and Kiefer's monumental apocalyptic landscapes continue Goya's legacy of confronting the darkness head-on. Even contemporary performance art and installations revisit the image of devouring as a metaphor for capitalism, for environmental collapse, for the endless cycles of consumption and destruction in our own age. Today, Saturn devouring his son feels more relevant than ever. In an age defined by overconsumption, ecological destruction, and self-devouring political systems, Goya's vision serves as a prophetic warning. It reminds us that what we build, nations, economies, technologies, can turn against us. That the systems we trust to sustain us may one day consume us instead. And that within each of us lies the same devouring hunger, the same primal darkness that Goya painted on his walls 2 centuries ago. When Francisco Goya died in 1828, Saturn devouring his son and the other black paintings remained hidden inside the walls of his home. He never exhibited them. He never sold them. In fact, he never even titled them. These works were never meant for the public. They were confessions, painted in solitude, conversations between the artist and his own demons. For decades after his death, the paintings were almost forgotten. It was only when a new owner of the house, Baron Emil Derlanger, decided to transfer them from plaster to canvas in the 1870s that they began to enter the public consciousness. The process was dangerous and imperfect. Some details were lost forever, but it preserved Goya's vision for the world to see. In 1881, de Erlanger donated the black paintings to the Spanish state. They were installed in the Museo del Prado, where Saturn has since become one of the most iconic works of European art. Visitors from all over the world come face to face with this horrifying image and walk away deeply changed. It is a paradox, A painting created in isolation, meant to remain hidden, has become a cornerstone of public art. And in that paradox lies part of its power. It forces society to confront what it would rather keep buried. When Saturn Devouring His Son was first shown, many critics were horrified. It was considered obscene, grotesque, even insane. But as time passed, perspectives shifted. The painting came to be seen not as madness, but as truth, a brutal, unflinching depiction of the darker side of human existence. In the 20th century, existentialists embraced it as a profound statement about the human condition. Psychologists used it to explore the unconscious. Political thinkers saw in it a warning about tyranny. And ordinary viewers saw themselves, their fears, their rage, their mortality, reflected back from the canvas. In the 21st century, Saturn Devouring His Son feels more relevant than ever. In an era defined by overconsumption, political violence, and ecological destruction, Goya's vision serves as a mirror. It reflects the destructive cycles we perpetuate and warns us of the consequences if we do not change. The devouring Father is no longer just a myth or a metaphor. He is us, our governments, our corporations, our societies, our own unchecked desires, consuming the future generation, piece by piece. Perhaps the most terrifying thing about Goya's painting is that it does not offer solutions. It does not comfort or console. It simply stares back, a raw, primal scream frozen in paint. But maybe that is precisely its purpose, to force us to look, really look, at what we are capable of, to confront the abyss within ourselves, and to remind us that understanding our darkness is the first step to overcoming it. 2 centuries later, Saturn Devouring His Son still grips us with the same intensity it must have had when Goya first painted it. It is a work born of pain, madness, and despair, and yet it is also one of the most profound statements about what it means to be human. It tells us that darkness is not outside of us, it is within. That the monsters we fear are not gods or demons, they are us, and that art's greatest power is not to decorate or to please, but to confront, to challenge, and to awaken.